moving swiftly on, our next guests, our next speakers are Aseel, Kayal, and Paul Rascagneres. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, it works. So, yeah, we are here to speak about an investigation we did. We named it GhostEmperor, and we will spend 20 minutes together, and we will describe you what we found. And it's an APT case, so advanced persistent threat for people who are not used to this kind of terminology. And what we will present today is, oh, sorry, too fast. Okay, so it was a work of 4 researchers from Kaspersky. So here today you will have Aseel and me, Paul, but we also work with 2 other people that was not able to come today, Mark and Vasiliy. So let's start by the topic and what is GhostEmperor. So it's a cluster of activities that was not documented before, so it's something new. We identify maybe some few links with other cases already documented, but nothing strong enough to really link stuff together, but we will see that later. It only targets government and telecommunication entities. From our visibility, at least, it's really the 2 kind of victims we identify. And we will see during the description that it's a high technical skill threat actor, at least from a development point of view. We will see from operation, it's maybe a little bit less advanced. They use a lot of well-known tools, but the malware itself is very, very advanced, and the analysis costs us a lot of resources, and you will see why later. One of the reasons is it's used Rootkit. So often when you speak about malware, people say to you, Rootkit does not exist anymore because Microsoft did a lot of improvement from kernel space security, but we will see it still exists, and developers find some tricks to load Rootkit even if it should be impossible. So let's speak about the initial infection, and almost all the system we identified was public-facing Windows Server. And if we look at the parent process of the malware installer, in most of the case, it's a web server process. We identify W3WP, which is 2IS web server, HTTPD, which is Apache, and OC4jar, G.jar, which is Oracle server. So we have an attacker that compromised system by the web service. I don't mean it's a vulnerability inside Apache. It can be a vulnerability on the application running by Apache. And something interesting for us is we identify an infection, the March 4, on an Exchange server. And if you follow the news at this time, it was 2 days after the publication by Microsoft about ProxyLogon. So we assume they use this vulnerability to compromise an Exchange server, which is front web in this case, and get the capability to execute command on the server. If we look more in detail the infection chains, everything starts by a batch file. And the batch file is simply a 1 line to execute a PowerShell script. And the PowerShell script create a service, run a service, and after everything is executed. So it's really the infection we identify. We know there is another infection chain because we have trace about this execution, but sadly we didn't get access to the file. So we know there is another way to compromise system by using a couple of additional executable and using side loading techniques, but we don't have the file, but just it exists. If we look at the PowerShell installer, so the PowerShell script needs an argument. It's a key that is used to decrypt the content of the PowerShell. It's pretty smart because if you have the file without the context, if you have the script, like on VirusTotal, you download it and you want to analyze it, you cannot do anything. Without the key, you cannot decrypt content, you cannot analyze the file. So it's interesting. If you don't have any log, you cannot really investigate this case. So the password is used to decrypt data, and the data are another embedded shell, if you wish, PowerShell script. And the purpose is to create a registry key and the registry key is designed to launch a service on Windows. So you have the path of the library for the service, and it creates two additional keys, registry keys. One will be additional payloads. I mentioned previously the malware deployed the rootkit on the system, so the rootkit is encrypted inside of one of the registry keys. And you have a C2 profile, malleable C2 profile. And if you are not used to that, it's something used a lot by CobaltStrike. CobaltStrike developed their own language to define how the malware will communicate to the C2 server. What is the pattern and stuff like that. And our attacker didn't use CobaltStrike, but implemented their own parser to understand malleable C2 profile and use them inside the rootkit, the malware. And we identified two different variants of the service deployed by that. One is developed in C++ and one is developed in .NET. The purpose is exactly the same, is to load the next stage. But there is a big difference between both. On the C++ version, the purpose is to decrypt something in registry, and they need a key to decrypt it. And on the C++ version, the key is hard-coded. So if you have the services, you read out the code, and you can get the key and decrypt the registry, which is kind of standard. If you look at the .NET version, they have something very specific that does not include any key, and the key to decrypt the content in registry is the GUID of the infected victim, infected system. It means the .NET sample, the executable, the service, only work on one machine in the world. It's designed to work on this machine because the encryption key is the GUID of this machine. So it's really unique, and it shows that the attackers have the capability to generate binary malware for a single system in the world. So they already have a lot of intel on these systems. It's probably already compromised, and they get some information on it, which is something that is kind of unique. So once the service is loaded, and it loads what the final implant, and as I mentioned, it uses malleable C2 profile to communicate outside. And in our case, they use this profile, which is a fake Amazon communication. So if you look at network traffic, it looks like Amazon, but in fact, it's a malware. They do something else. In addition to the URL pattern that looks like Amazon, they add fake headers. So in the screenshot you can see here, you can see it's a backup, and you can see the header of a JPEG and a header of a WAV file. So how it works, the attackers communicate, the infected machine communicate to the C2 server with this fake Amazon profile, and before sending the real data to the attackers, they add this fake header. So if you use IDS, for example, it looks like an image, and the flow will be accepted because it's an image. Or it looks like a wave, and the flow will be accepted because it looks like a legitimate sound. So that's another trick put in place by the developers. If we look at the implant capabilities, it allows full access to the compromised system. So the attackers can have a console and execute command, but it can also have a full desktop control like VNC or RDP. We didn't see it running, but based on our analysis, it seems to be super slow to use the desktop control, but it's here and it seems to work. It's also able to load dynamically .NET binary. So if the attackers need an additional feature, it can simply send the .NET, and it will be dynamically loaded and executed. And finally, it can execute PowerShell commands. If we look at the design, we have this service running some classes to control the workflow, and everything is injected inside winlogon.exe, so the legitimate winlogon process. And how both components works together, he creates namepipe. So when the attackers ask to execute a specific command, it's the communication between the service and the C2 server is done, saying, I want to execute this command. At this time, the the console payload is injected inside winlogon.exe, and they use a name pipe to, okay, I want to execute this command. The command is executed, send back to the name pipe, and send back to the attackers. So that's the global design of the communication, and it's the same thing for each module. And finally, we identify an additional component. So everything here is in user land. It's really something classical. That's how malware works today. But in this case, they use an additional stuff, and they load a rootkit. On Windows system, you normally cannot load drivers that are not signed by a legitimate provider. In this case, the binary is not signed, because nobody signed rootkit directly. And they use a legitimate driver, or legitimate, because it's software used to create crack for video games. So it's allowed to bypass protection in video game, and that's a real product, and it's signed. So you can use it to crack video game, but they use it to do something different and to load the rootkit on the system. It's something that is not already documented. That's the first actor we saw doing that. And how it works, first, you need to look like the cracking software. And to do that, he executes one of the components of this cheat engine software. And he takes a signature of this binary in user land. So he duplicate the signature of the legitimate cheat engine product. At this time, he is able to communicate with the driver provided by cheat engine. The driver is theoretically designed to manipulate memory and do stuff in memory to bypass video game protections. So instead of bypassing video game protection, we will see he will load a malicious driver, the rootkit. The workflow is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to quickly go on it. So you have the malicious services discussing with the cheat engine driver, the legitimate cheat engine driver. And at this time, he said to the cheat engine driver, okay, I want to load this shellcode in kernel space memory. The shellcode is loaded. What is the purpose of the shellcode? The attacker thinks there is not enough feature inside the cheat engine driver. So they add some additional features directly live in memory in kernel space. So they add this additional feature and say to the driver, okay, now I want to be able to use these additional features in memory. And the malware is able to use this new feature. And the purpose of this new feature is to load additional driver, which is not directly supported by default by cheat engine. And at this time, he is able to load demodex, which is the rootkit developed by the attackers. We need to understand that if anything fails in this graph, if a single arrow you see here is an error, you have a blue screen on Windows, because we are in kernel space and you don't have a second chance. So it's very, very stable. I didn't get any crash during investigation. I executed on all the versions of Windows, and it works perfectly. So now I will let Aseel continue and explain you a little bit more about the rootkit itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So now that the rootkit is finally loaded, we can discuss what it does. So the main purpose of demodex, which is the name we gave the rootkit, is to basically hide the malware's presence on the system from security or antivirus vendors and so on. And it does so by providing a set of IO controls to the user mode implant that enable it to hide certain things on the system. For example, to hide certain files or to hide registry keys that the malware uses, and TCP connections, and many more things. And one interesting thing to note here is that the rootkit supports the latest Windows 10 build. So when we tested this on a Windows 10 virtual machine, it worked, it was loaded successfully. So this, again, kind of indicates the amount of efforts that the attacker put in to overcome all the limitations that are found in the latest Windows builds, that it can be loaded there. And these are not the only tricks that the attackers use. They also use some things to kind of try to evade detection. Some tricks they use, they're quite common. For example, obfuscating the strings and hiding the strings in the rootkit. But there were other problematic things that they implemented. For example, zeroing out the PE headers of the rootkit. And this introduced some problems when it comes to forensic analysis. For example, the rootkit cannot, or the module cannot really be listed when when using the win-dbg lm or list modules command, although it can be, the driver object can really be viewed separately. And even when using volatility, we can see that volatility doesn't really show the full information about the driver's presence on the system. And another nice trick that the attackers use to also try to challenge the detection is to patch a legitimate driver, the PCI.sys, to conceal the source of invocation of certain functions. So if I just mentioned that the driver helps the malware hide its presence on the system and hides the presence of registry keys. And if we look at that registry callback in kernel space, we can kind of see that it looks as if it's originating from a legitimate driver from PCI.sys. But looking into the function itself at PCI.sys or at the code, we can really see that the code itself is just diverting the execution to the malicious registry callback. So the code of this driver was patched to hide, again, where the invocation is coming from. And after a successful infection, the attackers used multiple tools to spread further in the victim network and to collect more information about the system itself. So they used a lot of open source tools, for example, NBTscan or PowerCat, which is a PowerShell version of Netcat. They also used some Windows built-in tools to communicate with the C2 server, again, in a kind of stealthy way, like bitsadmin or certutil. And lastly, they used legitimate tools that are part of the sysinternal suite, and they also used WinRAR to compress and exfiltrate some of the files that they were interested in. And if we look at the logs from those tools and the commands that the attackers executed, we can really see that they're interested in stealing some sensitive documents or sensitive information from the victims, because they look for specific extensions such as Word documents, Excel documents. In one command, we see them looking for a PST file, which is a file that contains information from Outlook or Microsoft Exchange, so they want to steal emails or calendars and so on. And lastly, one interesting command we saw is this communication from bitsadmin with a website to download a malicious PowerShell script that belongs to the attackers. And this website used here is a legitimate government website. So we do believe that the attackers managed to compromise this government website before this attack and upload their own files to it and use it later on. Looking at their infrastructure, we see the attackers used multiple IP addresses. Some of them are under the same ASN or NetBlock for C2 communication. And we saw this communication in multiple stages of the attack. So like Paul mentioned in the in-memory implant with the malleable C2 profiles, and also with some of the tools that I've just explained. And the attackers also registered malicious domains. They had mostly random names, but you can see that some have subdomains like mail or IMAP to make them perhaps look legitimate when inspecting the traffic. With all of what we mentioned in mind, we attribute this activity to a Chinese-speaking threat actor based on multiple findings. First of all, some of the tools that we saw the attackers using are quite popular among Chinese-speaking attackers, such as Mimikat SSP, which is available on GitHub, and it's just a tool that is based on Mimikatz, and another tool called Ladon, again available on GitHub, and this one assists in lateral movement across the network. Another thing or another indication we got is one of the decryption keys that Paul mentioned. So the PowerShell script needs an argument, and one of the passwords or the decryption keys we saw was this unique string. And when we looked this up online, it led us to a GitHub account with the exact same name. So we don't really know if this GitHub account is linked to the activity. We don't really have any evidence of that, but we do see that there are some code repositories in Chinese within this account. And lastly, looking at the code, we noticed that the Demodex rootkit is similar to another rootkit exposed in 2015 called Durusby. And Durusby back then was also attributed to a Chinese-speaking threat actor. The rootkits both have a very similar purpose, like I explained, to hide the presence of the malicious activity. And looking at the code, we also see that they almost have an identical flow for the function to hide TCP connections. So we can assume that maybe the attackers shared resources or they are in some way connected. And looking at the map of victims that were affected by the GhostEmperor attacks, we can see that the attackers were mainly interested in targeting countries and high-profile entities such as government entities or telecommunication companies from 4 countries in Southeast Asia. But we did have a second cluster of victims that was in a kind of a remote location, and we saw victims from 3 countries such as Egypt, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan. And although at first this looks a bit unrelated to the main activity of the attackers, we did notice that some of those targets have ties to countries in Southeast Asia. So this would explain why the attackers would go after them, perhaps to reach their main targets through them, through the victims from the second cluster. So to conclude, one of the worst things or the biggest challenges we faced in this research is to separate this GhostEmperor activity or cluster from other malicious attack or from other threat actors that are present in networks, because we saw a lot of threat actors trying to exploit this vulnerability and gain access to Exchange servers using ProxyLogon. So it was really challenging to kind of take this activity out and focus only on GhostEmperor. And still so, this attacker was quite unique. This was one of the most advanced attackers we have seen, and this is one that aims to kind of maintain a long-standing operation in high-profile targets. We also saw them using some very impressive techniques to, again, kind of hide their presence in networks, and also to load this unsigned driver using this legitimate cheat engine tool. And lastly, I think one big takeaway to kind of remember from all of this is that rootkits are still relevant and attackers are still using them, so maybe we should keep an eye out for them in the future. And we can see that attackers as advanced as GhostEmperor are still willing to take advantage of them in their activity. And that's all from us. Thank you so much.